Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a story that history books rarely tell, a chilling tale hidden in the shadows of the Tudor dynasty. The year is 1603, and at England's Richmond Palace, the death of a monarch sets off a chain of events that would unravel a shocking secret. What if the end of Queen Elizabeth I wasn't a peaceful passing, but something far more sinister? A sealed letter, discovered amongst her personal belongings, hinted at a slow, deliberate poisoning. Was this the Queen's final confession? A revelation that she was both victim and perpetrator? This isn't the story of Gloriana, the celebrated Virgin Queen, but the untold account of a woman trapped by her own image, her legendary beauty becoming the very instrument of her demise. It's a tragedy that unfolds over decades, revealing the dark side of power, vanity, and the heavy price of a crown. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On a cold March morning in 1603, at Richmond Palace, a chilling discovery shook the entire English court. Among the personal effects of Queen Elizabeth I, who had ruled England for 45 years, a letter was found. This was no ordinary political document, but a record of such horrifying truths that its contents were immediately sealed and hidden from public view. That letter served as a belated confession, proving that the Queen's death was not the peaceful passing recorded in the history books. It suggested she did not die naturally, but instead wasted away over decades, intentionally poisoned perhaps by her own hand. To understand this tragic end, we must look back at the woman who lent her name to an age. Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, was one of England's greatest monarchs, reigning from 1558 until her death. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Genealogically, she belonged to the Tudor dynasty, a line marked by upheaval and tragedy. Her paternal grandparents were King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her maternal grandparents were Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard. Elizabeth's childhood was overshadowed by loss and instability. Her father, Henry VIII, was infamous for swiftly changing wives and religious affiliations in pursuit of a male heir. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was only 2, accused falsely of incest and adultery. After Anne's death, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her inheritance rights. She grew up in constant tension and danger, witnessing her father's subsequent marriages and the executions of her stepmothers, including Catherine Howard. These experiences forged in Elizabeth an extreme caution, sharp intelligence, and unshakable vigilance. She learned survival by concealing her emotions, trusting no one, and mastering every situation. On November 17, 1558, at age 25, Elizabeth ascended the throne, succeeding her half-sister Mary Tudor. Her reign, commonly called the Elizabethan era, lasted 45 years and is regarded as England's golden age. In religious affairs, she created a relatively stable peace after violent conflicts between Catholics and Protestants by enacting the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. She was a patron of the arts and literature, fostering talents like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Militarily and politically, her greatest achievement was defeating the Spanish Armada in 1588, a victory that not only thwarted invasion, but cemented England's status as a naval power. She skillfully maintained peace with other European powers through deft diplomacy and by refusing marriage, thereby preserving a balance of power. Known as the Virgin Queen, she turned her unmarried status into a potent political tool, symbolizing her total devotion to the realm. Yet Elizabeth's reign also had its dark side. She was notorious for her unpredictable temper, sudden outbursts of rage, and a deep paranoia about loyalty. She wielded power tightly and never truly trusted anyone. Her decision to execute Mary, Queen of Scots, remains a stain on her legacy. In her later years, she withdrew into solitude and became increasingly dependent on artificial appearance, a final obsession that ultimately led to her tragic demise. Elizabeth Tudor's path to the throne was paved with blood from the very moment of her conception. Born of King Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth entered a world where her very existence was considered illegitimate across Europe. When Elizabeth was only 2 years old, she witnessed the systematic destruction of her mother. The execution of Anne Boleyn in the year 1536 was not a swift event, but a carefully orchestrated political assassination, staged by her father to justify his own actions. The young princess saw her mother stripped of every title, her marriage declared null and void, and her very name erased from official records. On the 19th of May in 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London, where a French executioner severed her head with a single stroke of the sword. In that moment, Elizabeth, branded illegitimate, became an orphan and was left without rank, entirely at the mercy of a father who had already shown he would consign his own queens to death. The psychological impact of these early wounds cannot be overstated. Elizabeth grew up knowing that her father had murdered her mother, that her birth itself had catalyzed that tragedy, and that her very survival depended on her ability to please a man capable of ordering the deaths of those he once professed to love. The Tudor court was a place where even the youngest learned that love was fleeting, that power was paramount, and that the closest bonds could turn lethal without warning. Every subsequent marriage and annulment of Henry reinforced these cruel lessons. Elizabeth watched as her father took Jane Seymour as his third wife, only to lose her when she died giving birth to the long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward. She observed the swift dissolution of Henry's union with Anne of Cleves, and later the grisly execution of Catherine Howard, her fifth stepmother, dragged screaming to the block for alleged adultery. Each marriage, each annulment, each execution taught Elizabeth that survival in the Tudor world required unceasing vigilance and absolute self-control. As Elizabeth matured, she internalized these harsh truths. She learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of measured decorum, to observe every gesture in the court with careful attention, and to master the art of appearing pliant while harboring a will of steel. She realized that in this perilous environment, intelligence and discretion were her only reliable weapons. Her education in languages and literature was not simply an exercise in scholarship, but a strategy to outmaneuver the many factions vying for influence at her father's table. Whether in Latin, Greek, French, or Italian, she studied words as though they were shields, fortifying herself against slander and betrayal. When Henry VIII died in the year 1547, Elizabeth was only 14, but she had already honed the skills that would see her through her own reign. She understood that power often resided not in overt displays of force, but in the subtle command of perception, a well-placed word, a carefully chosen gesture, a promise half-made yet never fulfilled. In the quiet hours of her youth, she practiced these arts relentlessly, even as memories of her mother's final days haunted her. Upon the death of Edward VI and the brief reign of Mary Tudor, Elizabeth ascended the throne on the 17th of November, in the year 1558. The transition, though fraught with danger, felt almost inevitable to those who had witnessed her growth. Yet, the same lessons of ruthlessness and vigilance that had shaped her early life now demanded constant attention. Elizabeth, mindful of her precarious position, moved through the corridors of power as though treading upon eggshells, aware that a single misstep might bring the court's hidden daggers down upon her. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth never forgot the twin spectres of loss and betrayal that had defined her childhood. She maintained a court that was both enchanting and formidable, surrounding herself with loyal advisors while keeping them at arm's length. She cultivated a persona of grace and poise, yet beneath the surface lay the steel forged in the fires of her early traumas. Her reluctance to marry, often framed as an expression of personal choice, also served as a safeguard against the fate that had befallen her mother and her stepmothers. To bind herself in marriage was to risk surrendering the very power she had learned to cherish. Even as she navigated the complex web of international diplomacy, Elizabeth's mind remained alert to the quiet machinations of her own court. She read every letter with a wary eye, interpreted every gift with suspicion, and weighed every compliment against its possible intent. In her private chambers, she sometimes allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, recalling the little girl who had watched her mother's life stripped away. Yet those moments were fleeting. She quickly donned the mantle of queen once more, masking her fears behind a regal smile that concealed her relentless determination. In the end, it was this combination of shrewd intellect and unyielding caution that enabled Elizabeth Tudor to hold the crown for nearly half a century. The same politics of blood and suspicion that threatened her existence became the crucible within which her strength was tempered. Though the road to power had been carved with tragedy, Elizabeth emerged as a sovereign who understood the perilous price of rule. And so, the legacy of her ascent remains a testament to the harsh lessons she learned, that in the Tudor court, love could kill, power could save, and survival depended on mastering the delicate dance between trust and distrust, ever vigilant, ever wary, ever unwavering. The early years, fraught with tragedy, forged Elizabeth into a consummate master of deception. She understood, even as a child, that intellect was her only reliable weapon. Thus, she dedicated herself tirelessly to study and the sharpening of her mind. She became fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian languages she wielded as masks to conceal her true feelings and present an impenetrable facade. Publicly, she displayed fervent Protestant devotion to secure her position, yet in private, she quietly questioned every religious authority. She learned to read the most subtle signals in court politics, recognizing that her life might hinge upon interpreting a mere sideways glance, a deliberate gesture, or a carefully chosen word. The world around her was riddled with hidden snares, and the sole path to survival lay in unceasing vigilance and a refusal to trust anyone. When her father, King Henry VIII, finally passed away in the year 1547, Elizabeth already possessed the skills necessary to become a queen. She had cultivated the ability to present multiple faces to diverse audiences, a generous sovereign to her loyal counselors, a charming hostess to foreign dignitaries, and a humble servant of God to the faithful populace. She mastered the art of saying much while revealing nothing, imparting reassurance without ever betraying her deepest thoughts. She recognized that power demanded the ever-present threat of force, and that a woman in a position of authority was always viewed with suspicion. Survival required the sacrifice of personal desires in service of the political needs of the realm. In the hush of her private chambers, Elizabeth recalled the lessons of her childhood more acutely than ever. She had discovered that even royal parents could become executioners, and that no relationship, however intimate, was immune to betrayal. These childhood horrors laid the foundation for everything that would follow: her later obsession with her appearance, her unwavering refusal to marry, her paranoid vigilance toward loyalty, and ultimately, the tragic final years of her life. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth maintained a delicate equilibrium between openness and secrecy. She cultivated an aura of approachable majesty, inviting petitioners to present their grievances, while the inner workings of her court remained shrouded in mystery. She surrounded herself with confidants, yet few ever earned her complete confidence. Every counselor was chosen for skill, but retained in a state of respectful distance. She would praise an ally's accomplishments with genuine warmth, then discreetly test their devotion with subtle trials: a withheld letter, a delayed audience, a pointed question in council. Those who faltered were quietly dismissed. Those who triumphed earned her cautious favor. Her mastery of religious politics was particularly remarkable. She supported the Elizabethan religious settlement, which restored a moderate form of Protestant worship, while avoiding the extremes of both Catholic and radical Protestant factions. To the public, she appeared as the pious head of the Anglican Church, crowned by the Act of Supremacy. In private, she examined theological debates with keen curiosity, inviting scholars to debate contentious points of doctrine in her presence. Yet she never allowed her personal questions to undermine her public posture. In Elizabeth's court, faith was both sword and shield. It defended the realm against foreign powers and provided a moral framework for her subjects, while also serving as a mechanism for controlling noble dissidents whose loyalty remained uncertain. Elizabeth's skill with language extended beyond the scholarly. She used her pen as deftly as her voice, composing letters that could charm rival monarchs or chastise unruly nobles with equal grace. She dictated graceful missives to Mary, Queen of Scots, expressing sisterly affection even as she plotted Mary's downfall. She wrote flattering lines to foreign ambassadors, praising their sovereigns in terms that smoothed diplomatic ruffles. But she also drafted curt memoranda for her secretaries, exposing court intrigues in blunt, unsparing prose. Every written word was a weapon honed to a precise edge. Her physical appearance, too, became part of her carefully constructed persona. She invested vast sums in lavish gowns of crimson velvet and rich satin, embroidered with pearls and jewels. Her ample honey-blonde hair was artfully arranged and powdered to an ethereal hue. Yet beneath the layers of finery lay the embers of insecurity kindled by her scarred youth. She employed cosmetics made from rare pigments, layered to conceal the slightest imperfection. Each morning began with the ritual of powdering and painting, a ceremony that consumed hours and drew courtiers into a theatrical display of devotion. Through these outward trappings, Elizabeth projected an image of timeless majesty that helped bridge the gap between her human vulnerabilities and the divine right she claimed. Despite her careful construction, Elizabeth's heart bore the weight of constant isolation. She refused several political marriage proposals, even when alliances with powerful European dynasties hung in the balance. To wed would mean relinquishing an ounce of her sovereignty, and any consort could become a rival. Instead, she embraced her role as the Virgin Queen, conjuring the image of a ruler wedded only to her kingdom. This stance delighted her subjects and deterred foreign suitors, but it also deepened her loneliness. In the quiet hours, she would sometimes gaze into her mirrored reflection, wondering if the price of unbroken independence was the emptiness of companionship. As she aged, the trials of her youth and the burdens of statecraft took their toll. She witnessed factional uprisings, survived assassination plots, and navigated the delicate aftermath of the Spanish Armada's defeat. She bore witness to the deaths of beloved courtiers and the betrayals of supposed friends. Through it all, her reliance on deception and caution persisted. She trusted few, doubted everything, and masked her fears behind a regal smile that veiled the tumult beneath. In her final years, Elizabeth's refusal to compromise endured as the legacy of those early lessons. She remained ever watchful, her court a labyrinth of intrigue in which she reigned supreme. Though her rule ushered in an era of cultural flourishing and national pride, it was underpinned by the cold calculus of survival she had learned as a child. The hallways of Whitehall and Richmond echoed with whispered rumours of her shrewd manipulations, but Elizabeth moved through her kingdom with the confidence of one who knew she had outlasted every threat. And so, the woman who had been cast out as illegitimate, exposed to the horrors of parental betrayal, emerged as a monarch whose very mastery of deception became the engine of her success. From obscurity to the pinnacle of power, Elizabeth Tudor's life embodied the paradox of rule, that the greatest strength often springs from the deepest wounds, and that the path to lasting authority is carved by the willingness to wield intellect as both shield and sword, to sacrifice personal desires upon the altar of political necessity, and to learn, from the bloodiest of lessons, that in a world without certainty, only vigilance can ensure survival. In October 1562, at the age of 29, Queen Elizabeth I confronted a crisis that would prove a turning point in her reign and the beginning of her gradual descent into vanity. Smallpox, the disease that had claimed countless lives across Europe, struck the young monarch with brutal force. For days, she lay at death's door in Hampton Court Palace, her body consumed by fever, while her counsellors whispered about succession in the corridors just beyond her chamber door. When Elizabeth finally emerged from the ordeal, she discovered that the disease had robbed her of something far more precious than her health. It had destroyed the one thing she valued above all else, her legendary beauty. The scourge of smallpox left Elizabeth's face marred by deep pockmarks, most prominently upon her forehead and cheeks. In an age when a ruler's appearance was believed to reflect divine favour, this disfigurement was not merely cosmetic. It was a political catastrophe. Elizabeth's beauty had long been one of her most effective diplomatic instruments, used to charm foreign ambassadors and perpetuate the illusion that she might wed to secure powerful alliances. European courts spoke of her alabaster skin and inner radiance. They described a queen whose complexion seemed to glow with otherworldly light. That woman had vanished forever. The physical transformation wrought by smallpox carried a weighty psychological toll. Elizabeth had grown up acutely aware of the fragility of her power, balanced precariously between being alluring enough to attract suitors and independent enough to avoid marriage. Her beauty had served as armor, as weapon, and as shield. Without it, she felt vulnerable in ways that transcended mere physical insecurity. Courtiers at court noted that after her recovery, the Queen became increasingly fixated on mirrors, spending hours each day examining her reflection and experimenting with various beauty treatments. In her private apartments, long polished surfaces were arranged to capture her image from every angle, and she would sit before them for hours, studying the shadows and lines that daylight and candlelight cast upon her face. She tried soothing washes of rose water and delicate oils, massaging her skin in hopes of softening the harsh indentations left by the fever. Yet none of these gentle remedies could erase the scars that lay beneath. Instead, her fascination with cosmetics deepened, driven both by the desire to conceal her disfigurement and by the fear that her power would ebb if she appeared less than perfect to her subjects. It was during this period that Elizabeth first encountered lead-based cosmetic substances that promised to restore the smooth, pale complexion so prized by the nobility. Venetian Cyrus, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, offered the illusion of porcelain skin that could mask the pockmarks left by smallpox. To apply it, layers of this heavy paste were meticulously smoothed across the face, neck, and hands, creating a mask-like surface that reflected candlelight with ghostly brilliance. Above this base were added touches of kohl for the eyes and rouge, made from mercury sulfide for the lips and cheeks, all designed to mimic the radiance she once possessed. When spread thickly enough, the paste could disguise most scars, allowing her to reappear at court with an aura of unblemished beauty. But the very ingredients that gave her the appearance of youth and health carried within them a hidden menace, a slow, insidious poison that would accumulate in her body over time. In those first months after her illness, Elizabeth found solace in the temporary restoration that these cosmetics afforded her. Ambassadors once again praised her pale, flawless visage, and marriage negotiations quietly resumed as foreign princes speculated anew about the Queen's nuptial prospects. Yet Elizabeth's mind was never far from the knowledge that her beauty now depended entirely on the application of toxic substances. She insisted that all new portraits commissioned during this time depict her with smooth, ageless skin, forbidding any depiction of the scars that no longer showed through layers of paste. These mask portraits, as they came to be known, became instruments of propaganda, reinforcing the image she wished to present to both her own people and to the courts of Europe. At night, in the solitude of her chamber, Elizabeth would sometimes remove the heavy cosmetics and stare at her natural skin, tracing the depressions and ridges left by smallpox. She understood with uneasy clarity that to abandon the mask was to reveal her vulnerability, an admission she could never afford to make. The process of applying and removing the lead-based makeup became a daily ritual, one that consumed hours of her time and dominated her thoughts. Each dawn began with the grinding of pigments, the stirring of ceruse, and the precise layering of makeup that would allow her to meet the world once more in the guise of unbroken perfection. And each evening ended with the tedious removal of those layers, revealing a face ravaged by both disease and the very powders meant to conceal its scars. Despite her efforts, Elizabeth could not escape the gradual toll the lead was taking on her body. At first, the effects were subtle. A dull headache here, a momentary dizziness there, but over time, the chronic exposure to lead and mercury began to manifest in more alarming ways: tremors in her hands, a persistent weariness that no amount of rest could alleviate, and occasional lapses in memory. She continued to ride out these symptoms in silence, fearing that any admission of weakness might undermine her authority. Instead, she relied on the layers of powder and paint to conceal both her scars and her suffering, creating an illusion of invincible radiance that few could ever suspect was a fragile facade. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's dependence on these deadly cosmetics would deepen, entwining her fate with the substances she believed restored her to her rightful place. But in that first autumn of recovery, in the pale glow of Hampton Court's candlelit chambers, she discovered a bitter truth: that the very beauty which had been her greatest asset could also become her most potent poison. And so, the Queen who had once wielded her looks like a diplomat's sword now found herself bound by an unspoken contract with vanity, a contract written in lead and blood, whose consequences would unfold over the decades to come. Venetian ceruse, a blend of white lead and vinegar, promised to bestow upon its wearer a complexion as pale and smooth as freshly laid plaster, a fashion pinnacle among European nobility. Rare and costly, it was an exclusive elixir, devastatingly effective at concealing every imperfection. Applied in sufficiently thick layers, it could completely hide the pockmarks left by smallpox, recreating an artificial smoothness that mirrored the youthful beauty Elizabeth once enjoyed. Her ladies-in-waiting later described the elaborate ritual surrounding the Queen's daily application of cosmetics. Each morning, Elizabeth would sit for hours, as layers of ceruse were painstakingly brushed onto her face, neck, and hands. The process was meticulous, requiring multiple coats to achieve the desired opacity. Only once the base was firmly in place would supplementary cosmetics be applied. Coal dust carefully drawn around the eyes, a blush of vermilion made from mercury sulfide tinted her lips and cheeks, and delicate painted accents were added to sculpt and emphasize her facial contours. The immediate results were nothing short of spectacular. Foreign ambassadors once more lauded the Queen's appearance, marveling at her chalk-white complexion and otherworldly radiance. Marriage negotiations resumed with renewed fervour as European princes vied for the hand of the Virgin Queen. Through the artful use of chemistry, Elizabeth had resurrected her political power, projecting an image of unblemished majesty that few could resist. Yet beneath this veneer lay a tragic irony. The very substance that restored her influence would, over the course of 4 decades, poison her body in tiny, accumulating doses. The tragedy of Elizabeth's post-smallpox transformation was that it worked all too well. Lead-based cosmetics did not simply mask her scars. They created an ideal of perfection so convincing that it became inseparable from her royal identity. Portraits commissioned during these years depicted her face as smooth porcelain, with nary a scar to mar the surface images carefully curated to sustain the illusion. She forbade artists from painting her true visage, insisting that every likeness show her as an ageless monarch, a living symbol of unending youth. To abandon her powder mask would be to reveal the ravages beneath, and she could not afford such a breach. Yet to continue its use was to submit to daily doses of a toxic metal. Each morning's ritual became a silent ceremony of self-poisoning. Elizabeth sat in her private chambers, attended by the same discreet circle of trusted ladies, as the ceruse was applied in solemn precision. The paste, heavy and suffocating, coated her skin in layers so thick they resembled fragile armor. She would then allow a moment of quiet reflection, gazing into the several mirrors arranged around her, to ensure that every angle captured the flawless mask she required. Only when she was satisfied would she rise to face her court, the weight of her cosmetics concealed beneath sumptuous gowns and jeweled collars. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the lead absorbed through her skin accumulated in her tissues. At first, the effects were barely perceptible, a fleeting headache, an occasional dizziness. But slowly, insidiously, the metal began to break down her health. Chronic exposure to lead is known to degrade both body and mind over time. In Elizabeth's case, the early symptoms went unnoticed or were attributed to the burdens of rule. She pressed on undeterred, unwilling to sacrifice the appearance that had become integral to her authority. The dynamics at court shifted subtly under the veil of her apparent perfection. Courtiers found themselves dancing around an unspoken truth. They never saw Elizabeth's real face, only the radiant mask she presented. This separation created a kind of reverent distance, reinforcing her mystique but also feeding her isolation. Her reliance on cosmetics became as much a political tool as her speeches or her patronage. She wielded her image like a scepter, knowing that each layer of powder heightened her aura of invincibility. Yet in her private moments, those stolen hours, when the day's burdens were momentarily lifted, Elizabeth felt the weight of her choices. Removing her makeup revealed a visage more akin to a death mask than a living queen. She would trace the faded outlines of her pockmarks with a gentle fingertip, a silent acknowledgement of the cost of her beauty. Occasionally, she wept for the girl she once was, whose face needed no concealment. But such moments were fleeting. She had learned the hard lesson that vulnerability could be fatal. Over the decades, the cumulative poisoning began to manifest in more alarming ways. Her hands, once known for their graceful gestures, developed a slight tremor. She experienced bouts of fatigue that no amount of rest could dispel. In rare private correspondence, scribes noted that her once steady handwriting wavered, as though her nerves had been frayed by unseen forces. These signs were quietly hushed up, dismissed as the natural toll of a long reign. The public never suspected that the Queen's makeup, her most cherished decoration, was slowly unraveling her body. Faced with the relentless advance of poison, Elizabeth's commitment to her powder mask only intensified. Where others might have chosen to reduce or abandon such fatal adornments, she doubled down, layering her face thicker still to maintain the illusion. Her advisors, aware of the dangers yet powerless to intervene without betraying her deepest insecurities, offered only cautious counsel. Elizabeth, ever vigilant, rejected any suggestion that she lighten her own radiance, fearful that any sign of decline would embolden her enemies. In this way, a queen who had once carved her path through political intrigue, war, and religious strife, now found herself captive to the very beauty she had once wielded as a weapon. Her legacy, so carefully crafted through acts of state and displays of regal power, became entwined with the tragic irony of a ruler who poisoned herself for the sake of an image. Venetian Ceruse had offered a semblance of salvation in the aftermath of smallpox, but it exacted a price that Elizabeth would pay day by day until her final breath. Thus, the tale of Elizabeth's daily ritual stands as both a testament to her resourcefulness and a cautionary saga of vanity's hidden cost. In her pursuit of perfection, the Queen chose beauty over health, political leverage over physical well-being, and in so doing she set herself upon a path toward a slow, agonizing demise. A demise that, like her reign, would be commemorated in legend and cloaked in the same layers of carefully applied illusion that had defined her life. Elizabeth's reliance on lethal cosmetics was never merely a beauty regimen. It became an all-consuming obsession with her own image. The layers of Ceruse did more than conceal pockmarks and scars. They fashioned a flawless, ethereal countenance that grew into the very heart of her royal identity. She understood, in a quiet and fearful way, that to abandon her makeup meant exposing the ravaged skin beneath. Yet to continue its use was to ingest poison each dawn. In choosing beauty over health and political power over physical well-being, Elizabeth set herself upon an inexorable path toward a slow, agonizing demise. Her daily ritual, described by attendants as lasting up to 4 hours each morning, was a ceremony of systematic self-poisoning. First came the Ceruse base, layer upon layer of white paste applied with ritual precision. The lead within the Ceruse was especially insidious. It absorbed directly through her skin and accumulated in her body's tissues over time. Modern science now recognizes chronic lead exposure as causing a gradual deterioration of both mind and body, a decline that may remain hidden for decades before revealing its full devastation. Yet in Elizabeth's mind, the artificial pallor she wore each day was essential to her very right to rule. Once the foundation was in place, supplementary cosmetics were added. Kohl was drawn around her eyes, accentuating their brightness. Vermilion blush, crafted from mercury sulfide, dusted her cheeks and lips, giving them color and life. Each stroke of the brush was executed in silence, as though any sound might shatter the fragile illusion she was assembling. The process involved not only physical adornment, but a mental transformation. Elizabeth would sit motionless, eyes closed or fixed upon a polished mirror, willing herself into the persona she needed to project. By mid-morning, the Queen emerged from her private chambers as though stepping from a chrysalis. Courtiers would fall to their knees, proclaiming her beauty and grace. Ambassadors, accustomed to deference, found themselves softly praising her complexion, unaware of the toxic foundation beneath the regal exterior. Portrait painters were summoned, brushes in hand, to capture the perfection they perceived. All were briefed that no natural blemish should appear on canvas. In Elizabeth's final years, realistic depictions were forbidden. Only the smooth, ageless mask she wore in life could be preserved in art. These youth mask portraits, as later scholars would call them, proliferated throughout the realm and beyond. They were not mere artistic conventions, but deliberate propaganda visual declarations that the Queen's power was eternal. In palace galleries and private salons alike, these images hung in gilded frames, reminding subjects and visitors that their sovereign was untouched by time, disease, or death. The portraits spoke of purity and potency, concealing the disintegration of her health and the inner turmoil that drove her daily masquerade. In private, however, Elizabeth occasionally granted herself moments of reluctant candor. She would summon her most trusted confidant, a lady-in-waiting who had shared her secrets for years, and allow the mask to slip. Beneath the layers of Ceruse, her skin was said to have taken on the consistency of ancient parchment. Discolored, fissured, and devoid of resilience. She could feel the corrosive lead burning beneath, an ache that no ointment could soothe. Yet she never permitted this vulnerable face to be seen by even her closest allies. The fear that a glimpse of her true visage might embolden her enemies outweighed the desire for relief. Her dependence on cosmetics permeated every corner of court life. Special windows were installed to control the quality of light in her private chambers, ensuring that reflections remained flattering. Mirrors were placed at such angles that only the most benign views of her face could be glimpsed. In social gatherings, chambers were dimmed or curtained to prevent harsh daylight from revealing the slightest crack in her porcelain facade. The court adapted to the Queen's needs, wrapping itself in a protective cocoon of candlelight and velvet drapes. As time wore on, the Queen's physical vitality waned. She experienced tremors in her hands that sometimes betrayed her, even as her painted mask remained unflinching. She endured bouts of dizziness and exhaustion, yet never reduced her daily application of poison. In her mind, any concession would signal weakness and admission that she was less than the immortal icon she portrayed. Thus, she reaffirmed her resolve each dawn, brushing on the ceruse, as though each stroke preserved not only her image, but the sovereignty itself. The tragedy of Elizabeth's final decades lies in the double bind she faced. To relinquish her beauty was to weaken her power. To maintain it was to hasten her own destruction. Venetian ceruse had offered a fleeting restoration of youth, a return to her former radiance, and in its promise lay the seeds of unhindered self-annihilation. Her reign, celebrated for its cultural flourishing and political stability, was sustained by the very artifice that consumed her life force. Yes, she had chosen beauty over health, power over well-being, and as she sat in her chambers each morning white-masked, trembling beneath layers of lead, she knew that the price of her image was measured in the slow, inexorable erosion of her flesh and mind. Thus, the tale of Elizabeth's cosmetic dependency is a somber reminder of how the pursuit of perfection can become a merciless captor. Venetian ceruse gave her the appearance of invincibility, yet delivered the hidden sting of poison with every layer. Her story unfolds as a quiet tragedy of vanity's triumph over vitality, a cautionary chronicle of power's seductive and ultimately destructive allure. As the Queen rested beneath her heavy makeup, the court slept in ignorance of the slow, painful decay unfolding behind that seemingly flawless mask. And so, Elizabeth Tudor's final years became a spectral performance, in which every brushstroke of white lead was both an affirmation of her authority and a silent herald of her own demise. Over time, the ritual of applying cosmetics grew ever more elaborate, as Elizabeth aged and the ravages of lead poisoning became harder to conceal. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that the Queen insisted on ever thicker layers of ceruse to achieve the flawless opacity she demanded, for her natural skin had grown increasingly damaged and discolored. What had once been a handful of carefully applied coats transformed into something more akin to a construction project. Heavy paste spread so thickly that it would crack and flake throughout the day. Courtiers described waking to find small fragments of white powder scattered upon the floor and furniture, only to watch the Queen's attendants painstakingly reapply fresh layers in dimly lit antechambers. The economic cost of this obsession was immense. Elizabeth is said to have spent the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern currency on her cosmetic supplies, importing the finest Venetian ceruse and exotic pigments from ports as far-flung as Istanbul and Goa. The palace records, kept under tight guard, show that her spending on makeup represented a significant portion of the royal household's budget, a testament both to the value she placed on her appearance and to the ever-increasing quantities required to maintain the illusion of eternal youth. Each shipment arrived under the cover of night, accompanied by secret letters that spoke only of Her Majesty's personal necessities, and yet the volumes recorded hint at a scale of consumption almost beyond comprehension. As her anxiety over her appearance deepened, Elizabeth ordered the installation of specially designed mirrors throughout her palaces. Venetian craftsmen, renowned for their skill and secrecy, were commissioned to produce curved or faintly tinted surfaces that subtly altered reflections in her favor. In these bespoke mirrors, every line and shadow could be smoothed away, reinforcing the belief that the cosmetic transformation remained complete. The cost of these magical looking glasses was staggering. Lavish payments were made to ensure they never appeared in any other court. In her private chambers, Elizabeth would spend long, drowsy hours moving from mirror to mirror, observing her visage from every conceivable angle, as though assuring herself that the lead-laden mask had succeeded in preserving her regal perfection. By the 1870s of her reign, or rather, as her 70s approached in actual years, Elizabeth's behavior began to betray the subtle but relentless toll of chronic lead poisoning. Her attendants, accustomed to her regal composure, noticed growing irritability, memory lapses, and difficulty concentrating on matters of state. Where once her temper had flared only in carefully orchestrated displays of royal authority, now small slights could trigger explosive outbursts that terrified even her most trusted advisors. The same counsellors who had previously praised her wit and poise found themselves caught unawares by sudden storms of anger, preceded by barely perceptible tremors in her hands and a glazed look in her eyes. These temper tantrums, which had once served as calculated reminders of her supremacy, darkened into unpredictable explosions of rage. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of meetings abruptly ended when the Queen's voice rose to a shriek, or of ambassadors left cowering in corners as Elizabeth, enraged by a misplaced document or a forgotten name, struck tables or scolded her own scribes with savage intensity. In quieter moments, she would slump into a velvet-lined chair, head bowed, as though exhausted by the relentless demands of her own makeup-bound existence. It was said that, on occasion, she would gaze at her reflection and murmur apologies to the woman she had become. The psychological weight of such chronic poisoning manifested not only in her outbursts but also in profound periods of confusion and melancholy. The Queen, once the embodiment of clear-sighted purpose, sometimes forgot the names of her most steadfast confidants or lost track of the day's schedule, wandering the halls of Whitehall in a daze. Her verses, composed for court entertainments, grew shorter and more disjointed, with lines repeated or left unfinished. Yet the mask remained intact, both literally and figuratively. Public audiences continued to see the pale, smooth face of the Virgin Queen, never glimpsing the turmoil beneath. Through it all, Elizabeth clung to her daily beauty ritual, as though it were the very source of her sovereignty. She believed that her power, her legitimacy, derived from the unblemished facade she projected. Portraits commissioned during this later period reflect that conviction. All show her with unwrinkled skin and ageless features, gazing serenely outward as if untouched by time or tragedy. Yet behind those painted eyes lay the hidden cost of her unyielding vanity. Each morning's application of ceruse, each evening's removal and reapplication, stitched her ever deeper into a web of dependency, a slow-moving tragedy that would reach its culmination only after decades of self-inflicted harm. And so, as the candles burned low in her private chambers, and the drowsy hush of night enveloped the palace, Elizabeth Tudor remained a prisoner of her own perfection. The court adapted its protocols to protect her illusion. Diplomats lauded her beauty, and scholars penned treatises on her golden age. Meanwhile, the Queen herself sat before her mirrors, lost in a trance of reflection both literal and figurative, unaware that the mask she prized so dearly was in truth a coffin of her own making, built layer by layer in lead, and painted with the shadow of death. Elizabeth's existence had become a ceaseless struggle between outward illusion and inward reality. She knew with quiet dread that she was poisoning herself, yet she could not bring herself to stop. Her closest advisers, including William Cecil, Lord Burghley, had on more than one occasion pressed her to reduce her use of cosmetics, especially as rumours began to circulate about the untimely deaths of other noblewomen from cosmetic poisoning. Yet Elizabeth always refused. To appear without her powder mask, she insisted, was akin to abdication. She told them in hushed tones that she could not present herself to her subjects or to foreign dignitaries without her face. This artificial countenance had become an inseparable part of her identity as queen. The daily ritual of makeup had transformed into a form of torture from which Elizabeth could find no release. Her ladies-in-waiting spoke of a process that was as physically painful as it was emotionally brutal. The ceruse paste leaden, suffocating, burned her skin each morning, causing raw redness and irritation that cried out for yet more layers of concealment. The very substance meant to hide her flaws only intensified them, as fresh applications covered the inflammation, only to crack and flake by midday. Courtiers would discover tiny fragments of white powder scattered along the halls, a silent testament to the relentless cycle of application and renewal. The weight of the cosmetics was such that it pressed her skull like a rigid helmet. Elizabeth awoke each day to the dull ache of lead against bone, a headache that throbbed with every heartbeat. Her vivid expressions, once a hallmark of her charismatic presence, grew increasingly stiff and constrained. Where she once had smiled with genuine warmth, she now wore a forced, angular grin, a grimace held in place by sheer force of will. Those who observed her in private noted the lines around her mouth trembling as she tried to offer a borrowed cheer to her attendants. The emotional toll was equally severe. Elizabeth felt a growing sense of suffocation beneath the layers of her own creation, as though she were trapped within a plaster shell. In moments of rare solitude, she would press her fingertips against her temples, attempting to erase the pounding in her head. She confessed, in private letters to a trusted confidant, that she sometimes felt as though she were losing herself, the real woman beneath the makeup slipping away with each passing stroke of the brush. Her advisors watched this descent in silent alarm. William Cecil, whose loyalty to the crown had never wavered, approached the Queen with cautious urgency. He reminded her of the countless warnings that had reached Westminster, tales of ladies whose beauty regimens had ended in madness or sudden death. Yet Elizabeth's reply was always the same, a firm, unyielding vow that she would not allow herself to be seen without her mask. She would not diminish the power she derived from her appearance, for she believed her authority itself depended upon that flawless sheen. In public audiences, Elizabeth maintained her composure impeccably. She sat upon the throne, robed in velvet and embroidered satin, her painted face glowing like moonlight on a still pond. Petitioners trembled before her, offering heartfelt pleas that she granted with magnanimous nods. Foreign ambassadors praised Her Majesty, oblivious to the hidden torment beneath her porcelain facade. But behind the painted gaze lay a monarch burdened by the knowledge that every brushstroke was both a lifeline and a noose. The cruel paradox of her predicament weighed heavily on her spirit. She had mastered the art of deception in politics, yet she found herself deceived by her own vanity. Each day's application of lead-laden ceruse bound her more tightly to a destiny of slow self-destruction. Her command of languages, her polished speeches, her defensive proclamations all amounted to little if the Queen herself was crumbling from within. At night, in the dim glow of candlelight, Elizabeth would sometimes lift a single sleeve to her face and trace the outline of her wrist, an act of quiet defiance. The soft curve of her skin, unblemished by powder, reminded her of what had been lost. She dared not reveal that wrist to any but her closest companion, for it was proof of her vulnerability. The rest of her body remained encased in layers of toxicity, a testament to the choice she had made between the power of appearance and the frailty of life. As the years wore on, Elizabeth's reliance on her deadly cosmetics only deepened. The very image that had carried her through storms of politics and war now became her chains. She had sacrificed her health for an image that, once tarnished, she could not bear to reveal. The court adapted to her needs, altering schedules and protocols to minimize time spent under harsh light or in strenuous activity that might crack her mask. Her chambers became both sanctuary and prison, filled with the tools of her own undoing. In the twilight of her reign, Elizabeth Tudor existed in a state of perpetual performance, playing the role of immortal sovereign even as her body betrayed her. The world saw only the flawless visage she presented, never guessed the agony beneath. Her final chapters, written in layers of ceruse, would be marked by the slow decay of both mind and flesh, a tragic irony for a queen who had once ruled with unmatched brilliance. And so, each dawn, Elizabeth sat before her mirror, brush in hand, preparing once more to don the mask that had become her only shield. In that ritual, she reenacted the silent pact she had made long ago, that her beauty, however artificial, was worth the price of her very being. As the powder settled into the lines of her face, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, steeling herself for another day in the world. She had created a world in which perfection was both her greatest weapon and her most terrible curse. As the effects of lead poisoning became increasingly apparent, Elizabeth's isolation deepened. Foreign ambassadors, once dazzled by her beauty and intelligence, began submitting troubling reports about her appearance and behavior. The Venetian envoy noted that the Queen's hands trembled incessantly, her speech occasionally slurred, and her memory seemed to falter. More alarming still, he reported that her makeup had taken on a faint greenish tint, an unmistakable sign that chemical reactions were occurring on her skin, visible even through the thick layers of cosmetics. These dispatches travelled swiftly among European courts, eroding Elizabeth's diplomatic authority. Rival powers whispered questions. Was she still fit to rule, both mentally and physically? Increasingly, Elizabeth's world contracted. Once accustomed to the adoration of the public and the intrigue of diplomatic maneuvering, She now found herself retreating from view. Court festivities, grand processions, and public audiences all became sources of dread, for each occasion risked revealing more of her true condition. She limited her appearances to the most essential state functions: the opening of Parliament, the signing of treaties, and the occasional reception for foreign dignitaries. Yet even then, she insisted on dimly lit chambers and muted lighting, where shadows could conceal the worst of her disfigurement. Walls were draped with heavy tapestries to soften glare, and candles were placed at odd angles to cast flattering shadows across her powdered face. The court adapted to her withdrawal with a series of elaborate protocols, ostensibly matters of regal etiquette, but in truth, measures designed to protect both Elizabeth's dignity and the safety of her servants. Courtiers learned the precise distance at which to approach the throne rail, mindful that too close an encounter might expose them to the faint but unmistakable odor of decaying powder and poisoned flesh. Guests were briefed in advance on acceptable topics of conversation, steering clear of any subject that might provoke the Queen's unpredictable temper. Ambassadors received written instructions specifying the number of bows required, the precise wording of their formal address, and even the type of seating arrangement that would best obscure her facial tremors. These protocols, while cloaked in the language of tradition, functioned as subtle safeguards. They prevented situations in which Elizabeth's condition might be laid bare to visitors, and they minimized the risk that her sudden, ungoverned outbursts, symptoms of chronic lead toxicity, could result in dangerous incidents. A misstep, such as standing too close, could bring a tremor of her hand into contact with a ceremonial goblet, sending it crashing to the floor and shattering the illusion of royal poise. Worse still, a careless question about the Queen's health or a mispronounced name might trigger a storm of rage so fierce that seasoned courtiers would shrink back in alarm. As rumours of her instability spread, envoys from other courts began arriving under heavier guard, accompanied by learned physicians whose role was ostensibly to observe her health, but in reality to confirm or deny the whispers of her decline. These medical guests were granted brief audiences, during which they were presented with the carefully curated mask of Elizabeth's most composed self. Yet even they could not ignore the tremor in her voice, or the pallor of her skin beneath the layers of powder. Their private reports, sent under seal to their home governments, spoke of a monarch clinging to power through artifice and will alone. Amidst this atmosphere of hushed concern, Elizabeth found herself more alone than ever. The corridors of Whitehall, once echoing with eager footsteps and whispered counsel, were quieter now, save for the hurried shuffle of attendants attending to her cosmetic needs. In her private apartments, she would pace slowly before her collection of specially crafted Venetian mirrors, each one bent or tinted to render her reflection as benign as possible. There, in dim candlelight, she would linger, tracing the outlines of her painted visage, as though searching for the woman she had been before smallpox and lead had rewritten her story. Her isolation was compounded by the very measures taken in her name. By the time the daylight chambers were sealed off and the protocols installed, Elizabeth's world had become a series of filtered impressions, half-seen faces, muted voices, and rehearsed compliments. She caught only fleeting glimpses of the kingdom she ruled, conveyed through the controlled pages of court diaries and the performed loyalty of long-trained actors playing the parts of noblemen and ambassadors. The vibrant tapestry of England's social and political life, once her domain to navigate, now existed beyond a veil of powder and protocol. Yet still, Elizabeth did not relent. To remove her makeup would be, in her mind, the ultimate surrender. She had often declared that the face she presented to her people was her true self, that without it, she would no longer exist as queen. In her drowsy moments before dawn, she would consider the possibility of stepping away from the mirror, letting the layers of ceruse fall away. She imagined the freedom of bare, unblemished skin, the release from the daily torment of reapplication and concealment. But each time, the terror gripped her of the world, seeing her vulnerability, of the court's conspiracies reigniting, of her carefully preserved power unraveling. The cycle continued, day after day, until Elizabeth's reign, once defined by the golden promise of peace and prosperity, became overshadowed by her own haunted visage. The crown she wore bore the weight of her sacrifices, political, personal, and physical. She had faced countless threats, foreign invaders, religious zealots, rebellious lords, and triumphed. Yet it was the slow, inexorable toxicity under her own skin that truly claimed her in the end. In those final years, Elizabeth was less a monarch and more a legend, a spectral figure moving through half-lit halls, her steps guided by the soft whispers of attendants and the muted echoes of her former glory. The protocols that surrounded her, the chambers that shielded her, the mirrors that deceived her, all served to hide the truth of her condition. And so she remained, trapped behind a mask of her own making, a ruler who had mastered the art of deception in statecraft but could not escape the ultimate deception of vanity and poison. Thus, Elizabeth Tudor's life drew to a close in a paradox of power and mortality. Her reign, lauded for style, substance, and spectacle, ended beneath layers of lead and lacquer. She had refused to relinquish her image, even as it consumed her from within. In the hush of candlelit palaces, as shadows danced upon the tapestries and protocols dictated every movement, the once fierce queen faded away, leaving behind a legacy as beautiful as it was bitter, a crown weighed down not by gemstones, but by the grim toll of her own painted perfection. By the 1990s of her reign, the cumulative effects of 4 decades of lead poisoning had begun to transform Elizabeth I from England's formidable monarch into a tragic figure whose grip on power was slipping away. This was the queen once celebrated for her brilliant intellect and shrewd political instincts, now struggling with the most basic cognitive tasks, even as the elaborate court protocols that surrounded her made it difficult for anyone to gauge just how far her decline had progressed. Her most trusted advisors found themselves managing not merely a kingdom, but an increasingly unstable ruler whose decisions could no longer be relied upon. The physical symptoms of chronic lead toxicity had become impossible to conceal, despite the thick layers of cosmetics she applied each morning. Elizabeth's hands, once lauded for their graceful gestures, now trembled continuously, an affliction her physicians dismissed as nervous temperament, but which modern medicine would recognize as a classic sign of heavy metal poisoning. Where her posture had been statuesque and dignified, she now required the support of nearby furnishings or the steady arm of a courtier to navigate the halls of Whitehall. Observers whispered that the Queen moved as though walking upon ship's deck in stormy seas, each step uncertain and wavering. Most alarming of all was the dramatic shedding of her famous red tresses. Strands of hair fell away in clumps, leaving her scalp exposed in patches. To maintain her public image, Elizabeth became ever more dependent on elaborate wigs, baroque constructions of wire frames, and dyed horsehair, piled high and pinned in place. These cumbersome hairpieces, though ornate, did little to disguise the reality beneath, a queen whose own body had turned against her. Even more troubling was the state of Elizabeth's mind. Where once she navigated complex matters of state with ease, she now faltered over names she had known for decades. Steadfast counsellors found their own identities slipping from her memory in bewildering moments of confusion. She might summon Lord Burghley only to address him as Lord Bacon, or congratulate an ambassador on a treaty that had been signed years earlier. In private councils, she sometimes lost the thread of discussions on finance or foreign policy, staring blankly at her papers as if reading them for the first time. One especially haunting incident occurred in her private chambers, where Elizabeth was discovered speaking animatedly to her own reflection in the mirror. She seemed to believe she was addressing her mother, Anne Boleyn, asking questions and seeking reassurance as though the executed queen stood before her. Attendants later reported that Elizabeth spent long stretches conversing with this ghostly image, her tone alternately pleading and reproachful. These episodes grew more frequent with each passing year, though they were carefully hidden from all but those few entirely trusted members of her household. The psychological turmoil of these encounters weighed heavily upon her. In moments of lucidity, Elizabeth recognized the absurdity of confiding in a painted likeness, and yet the mirror offered her a companion no living courtier could provide. The ghost of her mother, perpetually youthful and unscarred, stood as a poignant contrast to the leaden mask she herself wore. And so, each day, she would approach that looking-glass with a mixture of dread and longing, seeking solace in an illusion that only deepened her isolation. Her advisors, faced with this downward spiral, clung to the protocols they had devised. Dimly lit rooms for audiences, restricted access to private apartments, and limited public functions. They adapted every facet of court life to shield both themselves and foreign visitors from witnessing Elizabeth's most alarming moments. The official explanation for these changes remained that the Queen was cautious and invested in maintaining a solemn dignity. Beneath that polite veneer lay the unspoken truth that they feared for her and for the stability of the realm she once commanded so effortlessly. Despite her diminished faculties, Elizabeth's reputation endured, buoyed by decades of successful rule and the potent myth of the Virgin Queen. Portrait painters continued to depict her in resplendent robes, her painted face smooth and unlined, her elaborate wigs perfectly coiffed. These images, displayed in royal galleries and noble homes across Europe, sustained the illusion of an imperishable sovereign. Yet they also served as silent testaments to the lengths the court would go to protect their monarch's mystique, even as her body and mind decayed beneath the layers of lead-based powder. In public ceremonies, Elizabeth retained enough charisma to inspire loyalty among the masses. Her voice, though occasionally shaky, was still capable of delivering stirring addresses that reminded her subjects of the glories of her reign. She presided over pageants and festivals with a kind of ritualized grandeur that spoke to tradition more than genuine vitality. The crowds, accustomed to seeing her from a respectful distance, marveled at her seeming continuity, yet few grasped the depths of her hidden suffering. Meanwhile, those who served her most closely bore the burden of her care in private. Gentle hands guided her through corridors. Steady brows watched for signs of disorientation, and whispered prayers offered what comfort they could. The Queen, who had once inspired awe with her unwavering gaze, now relied on the kindness of her ladies to help steady her trembling body and calm her racing thoughts. In their empathy, these loyal attendants found themselves witnessing a private tragedy that would remain unspoken for generations. As the decade wore on, the question of succession loomed ever larger. Elizabeth, despite her advanced age and declining health, refused to name an heir, determined to preserve the autonomy she had fought so hard to maintain. This resolve, however, further isolated her, for it denied her advisers the certainty they desperately needed. They understood that their queen's power, and perhaps her life, depended upon the very image she had so painstakingly cultivated, even as that image betrayed her from within. In those final years, Elizabeth Tudor stood at the crossroads of legend and mortality. Her reign, once defined by triumph over external enemies, now faced an internal adversary she could neither vanquish nor escape. The crown she wore rested uneasy upon her powdered brow, weighed down by the lead that had become both her shield and her shackle. Though she remained outwardly regal, the soul of the Virgin Queen had grown ghostly, haunting the corridors of Whitehall even as the sun rose on a kingdom that would soon pass into new hands. And so, Elizabeth's story in the 1990s of her reign became one of profound melancholy. A ruler who had mastered every threat from without, only to be undone by the slow poison within. Her legacy, immortalized in gold and oil, hid the bitter truth of her decline, a truth that only the darkest corners of her private apartments had ever truly known. In those dimly lit rooms, where mirrors reflected a fading figure and hearts trembled at each uncertain step, the once mighty Queen faced the most relentless adversary of all, the passage of time and the unforgiving toll of her own vanity. In the winter of 1602, Queen Elizabeth I began to enter her final stage of decline. The cumulative effects of 4 decades of lead poisoning had reached a point of no return, manifesting symptoms that could no longer be hidden behind layers of cosmetics. The woman once renowned for her razor-sharp intellect and political acumen now struggled to sustain coherent conversation. She would often pause mid-sentence, her gaze drifting inward as though she had forgotten the very words she intended to speak. Perhaps most alarming was her deepening obsession with death and the supernatural. Elizabeth reported seeing apparitions of figures from her past, most frequently her mother, Anne Boleyn, and her half-sister, Mary Tudor. These haunting visions, which modern medicine recognizes as classic symptoms of severe lead toxicity, convinced the Queen that the ghosts of those who suffered under Tudor rule had returned to torment her. She would spend hours in her private chambers, speaking softly to empty chairs as though addressing spectral guests. Attendants learned to tiptoe around her while she held court with the unseen, not daring to interrupt her or draw her attention back to the living world. Physically, Elizabeth's condition became grotesque. Decades of applying lead-laden makeup had left her natural skin so damaged that it no longer healed. The once supple flesh of her face and hands was now crisscrossed with ulcers and lesions, weeping a persistent discharge that seeped into the folds of her ruffs and the seams of her gowns. The odour was unmistakable, a sour, metallic stench that no amount of the finest perfumes could fully mask. Those tasked with her care moved quickly and discreetly, yet even they admitted that the smell clung to clothing and lingered in the air long after she had departed a room. Her hair, what little remained after years of shedding, had turned a ghostly white and fell out in patches. Wig makers were kept busy crafting ever more elaborate hairpieces to conceal the ravaged scalp beneath. These wigs, made of stiffened horsehair and pinned into towering shapes, weighed heavily on the Queen's brow and further aggravated her headaches. Each morning, as she struggled to fit the fragile frames into place, she winced at the first tug of pins through the tender skin of her scalp. Perhaps the most horrific of all her afflictions were her teeth. Having used mercury sulfide rouge for decades to colour her cheeks and lips, Elizabeth now suffered the classic dental effects of mercury poisoning. Her teeth turned black and began to loosen, one by one falling into her mouth during meals or crumbling into her lap when she laughed. Courtiers claimed to have witnessed her pressing a handkerchief to her mouth to disguise the sight of a missing tooth. Yet even this small attempt at concealment could not hide the advancing decay. The mere act of eating had become a form of agony, each bite threatening to dislodge another molar or incisor. Elizabeth's mind, too, bore the unmistakable marks of her self-inflicted curse. She would wander the halls of Whitehall, her steps unsteady, muttering fragments of letters or half-remembered lines of poetry. On nights when the wind howled outside and the palace corridors lay silent, she was sometimes heard singing lullabies to the ghosts she imagined around her songs once sung to her as a child, now twisted into mournful refrains. Attendants who crept to her door spoke of hearing her images speak back, offering solace one moment and accusations the next. Yet, even as her faculties slipped away, Elizabeth clung desperately to the vestiges of her power. On rare occasions, she emerged to hold a brief council, her voice quavering, but her demands as imperious as ever. She would sign official documents with a trembling hand, the strokes of her quill wandering off the prescribed lines, but still gird herself with the language of authority. In these fleeting moments, those in attendance saw a flicker of the Queen they had once known, the strategist, the diplomat, the indomitable sovereign, but it vanished, almost as soon as it appeared, swallowed by the hollow shell of addiction and disease that had become her final refuge. Her bedchamber, once a place of rest and contemplation, transformed into a theatre of despair. The walls, lined with tapestries depicting glorious Tudor victories, seemed to close in on her. The air grew thick with the mingled scents of ointments, oils, and the ever-present tang of decay. Elizabeth, who had built her legend on the idea of unending youth and beauty, now lay surrounded by the trappings of mortality. Wax candles burned low in their sconces, the shadows in the corners lengthening imperceptibly as though alive. She drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams filled with visions of execution scaffolds and the silent faces of her lost family. Her loyal servants did what they could to ease her suffering. They boiled herbal decoctions and brewed bitters meant to cleanse her blood, though none could counteract the relentless accumulation of lead and mercury. They dressed her wounds as best they could, wrapping her hands in clean linen and applying soothing salves that offered only temporary relief. They trimmed the ragged edges of her gowns and adjusted the necklines of her kirtles to accommodate her swollen joints, all the while whispering prayers for her comfort and her soul. In these final months, Elizabeth's court resembled a small, trembling ship, its captain too weak to steer, and its crew fearful of the storm that raged within her. Envoys still arrived from abroad, though fewer than in years past, and they were met in half-lit chambers where every precaution was taken to preserve the illusion of regal stability. Protocol dictated that no foreign guest leave her presence without witnessing at least a semblance of her former grandeur. Yet ambassadors returned home with hushed accounts of a monarch haunted by shadows and burdened by invisible chains. And so, into the closing winter of her storied reign, Elizabeth Tudor moved forward on feet unsteady and hands trembling, her mind a labyrinth of fading recollections and spectral voices. The Queen, who once stood as a towering figure in England's golden age, now found herself at the mercy of slow, inexorable decay. Her body, ravaged by decades of cosmetic warfare, betrayed her at every turn. Her spirit, worn thin by guilt and fear, clung to the last vestiges of her image, desperate to hold on even as the world she once commanded receded beyond her reach. In those hushed corridors, where candlelight danced upon delicate tapestries and the hush of winter settled over Whitehall, the final act of Elizabeth's life unfolded as a quiet tragedy, an epic tale of power and vanity, ambition and mortality, played out in the waning moments of a queen who could not relinquish her mask, even as it consumed her entirely. The ritual of applying makeup, which once consumed 4 hours each morning, now devoured Elizabeth's entire day. As the damage to her natural skin progressed, more layers of ceruse and supplemental cosmetics were required simply to approximate a human appearance. The heavy paste would crack and flake under its own weight, scattering white fragments like fallen snow across the floor. To maintain any semblance of continuity, attendants would reapply fresh coats in hidden recesses of the palace, repeating the process again and again until evening. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting described a spectacle more akin to preparing a death mask than adorning a living sovereign. They spoke of the Queen's face as a construction project, rebuilt each day from toxic materials that were slowly killing her from within. Even as her body ached beneath the layers of lead and mercury, Elizabeth understood all too clearly the paradox of her existence. In the hushed privacy of her inner chamber, with only her most trusted attendants present, she would talk of feeling poisoned by beauty. She confessed, in quivering whispers, to deep regret for the choices that had led her to this state. Yet she felt trapped by the very image she had so carefully crafted. To appear before her subjects without that painstaking transformation was, in her mind, unthinkable. Without the pale smoothness of her painted face, she feared she would lose not only her authority but her identity. The Virgin Queen had become a prisoner of her own vanity, locked in a self-destructive cycle she could not break. Meanwhile, the kingdom she ruled began to feel the tremors of her decline. Decisions that once took days to finalize now dragged on for weeks. As Elizabeth, mired in confusion or hidden away in her private rooms, delayed crucial correspondence and state documents, her indecision in matters of diplomacy created ripples across Europe. Foreign emissaries, accustomed to her astute judgments, returned home with reports of contradictory messages and uncoordinated directives. England's standing among the great powers wavered as the Queen's mental clarity faltered, and her inability to sustain the delicate balance of alliances threatened to unravel the tapestry of treaties she had woven over decades. At court, conversations shifted from scholarly discourse and cultural patronage to whispered rumours and careful sidesteps. Where once the corridors of Whitehall rang with intellectual debate and artistic flourish, now they were hushed. Courtiers tiptoed through the halls, wary of drawing the Queen's sudden attention or inciting one of her unpredictable outbursts. Gilded halls that had hosted lavish banquets and theatrical performances became places of caution and protocol, where every step and every word were measured against the risk of provoking her fragile nerves. Elizabeth's isolation deepened in direct proportion to the decay of her faculties. She avoided grand ceremonies and public receptions, fearing that a tremor or a lapse in speech might betray the siege her body endured. Even close friends and long-serving advisors found themselves barred from private visits, restricted by new layers of security designed to maintain the facade of regal composure. Those few who still had access to her presence bore witness to a sovereign haunted by the weight of her own reflection, speaking to painted portraits as though they held the key to her lost vitality. The Queen's once celebrated passion for the arts and learning waned as her world contracted to the bounds of her apartments. The musical ensembles and theatre troupes that once thrilled her with performances and masks were gradually dismissed. Books, which had been her refuge in earlier years, lay unopened upon silken cushions, gathering dust in dim alcoves. The vibrant intellectual life of her court faded into silence, replaced by the soft rustle of curtains and the stifled sighs of attendants moving in a palace that felt more like a sepulchre than a seat of power. Despite the kingdom's growing hardship, Elizabeth clung tenaciously to her throne. She refused suggestions that she appoint a regent or name an heir, adamant that any concession would signal weakness. Her advisors, torn between loyalty and desperation, struggled to navigate a realm in peril. They issued edicts in her name, knowing she might never see them, and dispatched envoys with letters that carried the weight of her signature, a signature now quivering at the end of each word. In the absence of her guiding hand, factions within the court eyed one another warily, awaiting the moment when the Queen's decline would tip the balance of power in favour of bolder claimants. In the grey hush of winter days, Elizabeth's isolation found an echo in the kingdom itself. Plots and counterplots simmered beneath the surface, fueled by uncertainty and opportunism. The people, deprived of their sovereign's steady presence, grew restless, their loyalty tinged with unease. Rumours spread as swiftly as shadows at dusk, that the Queen was ill, that her days were numbered, that some would claim the crown once she passed. The majesty of the Tudor era, so carefully cultivated, threatened to crumble under the tangible weight of her faltering health. Yet Elizabeth, even in her waning strength, retained a measure of regal dignity. On the rare occasions she appeared before her council, she sat at the head of the table, propped upon cushions, her powdered visage unmoving, her voice low but firm. She would grant audiences to ambassadors, offer her thanks for loyal service, and accept petitions with a nod. These appearances, though brief, reminded all who witnessed them of the sovereign who had once electrified the world with her brilliance. For a moment, the glamour of her reign flickered back to life, casting a glow over the court and reassuring those who served her that the spirit of the golden age still lingered, if only for an instant. But those moments grew ever briefer as Elizabeth's condition worsened. The days of winter in 1602 closed in around her like shutters against approaching night. The palace seemed to sigh with her laboured breaths, walls heavy with the sound of time's passing. And in the hush that fell when attendants left her side, Elizabeth sat alone before her mirrors, brush in hand, preparing herself for yet another day's masking of her pain. A slow, poignant reminder that the greatest battles are often those fought within. In the final weeks of her life, as Elizabeth lay at death's door in Richmond Palace, her behaviour took on an alarming urgency. Despite her deteriorating body and frequent episodes of confusion, the Queen became obsessed with composing what she called her Final Testament, a document she crafted in secret, most often during the pre-dawn hours when the corridors lay silent and her mind felt clearest. This letter, discovered among her personal effects after her passing, contained revelations so disturbing that her successor, James I, had it promptly suppressed. What made Elizabeth's last letter so shocking was its unsparing honesty about her reign and the price she had paid for power. In trembling handwriting, she confessed to decades of deception and manipulation, describing her own make-up ritual as a slow suicide of vanity. She admitted that for years she had been fully aware of the lethal nature of the cosmetics she applied, yet felt powerless to abandon them without sacrificing her political authority. Elizabeth wrote of her daily application of poisonous powders as a form of beautiful self-murder. She chose over appearing before her subjects in her natural, scarred state. Most disturbing of all was the suggestion that her cosmetic poisoning might not have been entirely accidental. She wrote cryptically of those who would see me painted into my grave, implying that certain courtiers had encouraged her increasingly hazardous beauty rituals while fully cognizant of their toxic effects. The Queen seemed to believe she had been the victim of a slow-motion assassination, carried out not with daggers or poisoned cups but through the careful exploitation of her vanity and insecurities. As she penned these final words, Elizabeth's hand shook violently, the lead-laden powders in her bloodstream making every movement painful. Yet she persisted, driven by a desperate need to unburden her soul before the end. She described scenes of her solitude, of candlelit hours spent hunched over her writing desk, quill in hand, the feather's tip blotted by tears, and the black ink running with smudges. She admitted to lying awake through the witching hour, haunted by visions of her mother's severed head and her half-sister's accusing stare, convinced that their restless spirits walked the corridors at her side. In her testament, Elizabeth also reflected on the paradox that had defined her reign. The very image that had secured her throne was also its undoing. She recalled how foreign ambassadors once marvelled at her alabaster complexion and her court's lavish entertainments, unaware that behind the scenes she spent hours each day caked in lead and mercury. She confessed that the portraits commissioned in her later years, which showed her with eternally smooth skin, had been part of a deliberate propaganda campaign, one she now saw as a betrayal of her own truth. The Queen's final pages contained passages of profound regret. She lamented the loss of genuine intimacy with her closest advisers, noting that even William Cecil, Lord Burghley, had been kept at arm's length by her fear of revealing a flawed visage. She wrote of nights spent sobbing softly into her pillow, mourning the woman she had once been, a woman who had walked the decks of warships, negotiated peace treaties, and inspired poets and playwrights. Now, reduced by poison and paranoia, she felt like a ghost haunting her own chambers. Elizabeth's testament concluded with a stark warning that the pursuit of an impossible ideal of beauty could become a weapon turned against its wielder. She urged her successors, who would almost certainly be men indifferent to female vanity, to learn from her folly. She entreated them not to equate appearance with legitimacy, reminding them that true authority derived from character and intellect, not from the sheen of cosmetics or the artifice of portraiture. When the letter was found, it was bound in crimson ribbon and tucked inside a small wooden box, hidden beneath folds of velvet in a carved ebony chest. James I ordered the box sealed and the document consigned to the Royal Archives, where it would remain hidden for centuries. His courtiers rejoiced at the opportunity to preserve the myth of the Virgin Queen, an image of unblemished grace and unwavering power that they feared would crumble under the weight of Elizabeth's confessions. In silencing her testament, James effectively erased the last, most vulnerable statement of a monarch who had given her name to an era. Few in his court dared to speak of the letter, and those who did lost favour quickly. The story of Elizabeth's poetic self-examination faded into rumour, supplanted by sanitized histories that portrayed her death as a serene transition from one golden age to another. The true horror of her final days, her desperate plea for understanding, and her belief in a court that had conspired against her through flattery and powder, was buried in darkness. Yet in those pre-dawn hours, while Richmond Palace still slumbered and Elizabeth's quill scratched the final lines of her life story, she was as naked as any woman. Before her mirror, stripped not of her crown but of the illusions that had sustained her. The testament she wrote was a mirror in its own right, a reflection of the costs of power, the dangers of vanity, and the fragile boundary between sovereignty and self-destruction. And so, in the hush that followed her last breath, the Queen's testament lay waiting unsent, unread, hidden its truths locked away alongside the powder pots and cracked mirrors that had defined her final years. In that silence, Elizabeth Tudor's voice echoed faintly, a whispered admonition to future generations, that the pursuit of perfection, even for those who sit upon the highest thrones, may carry a price too terrible to bear. The letter also contained Elizabeth's own analysis of how lead poisoning had affected her reign. In neat, yet trembling handwriting, she admitted to signing documents she could not recall and making decisions that later filled her with remorse. She attributed these errors to what she called the fog of metal in my mind, a weighty phrase that revealed the depth of her suffering. Elizabeth confessed that the steady ingestion of lead and mercury had clouded her judgment, turning once precise deliberations into hazy vacillations. She described moments when names and dates eluded her entirely, as though the clear memory she had once relied upon was shrouded in a murkiness she could neither dispel nor escape. Most harrowing were her admissions of complete lapses in consciousness, periods of hours, sometimes even days, during which she had no memory of ruling. In these blackout episodes, Elizabeth feared that other hands had guided her quill and given her assent to policies unknown to her waking mind. She wrote of waking with a start, in unfamiliar rooms or among strangers, certain she had slept through events of state that would only be revealed to her later. The Queen admitted that she lay awake at night, haunted by the dread that, in her absence, decisions shaping the kingdom's fate might have been made without her knowledge or consent. These confessions cut to the very core of sovereignty, a ruler who could not be certain she had ruled. She asked, in words fraught with pain, whether authority held any meaning if the mind wielding it was untrustworthy. Elizabeth's vulnerability shone through these lines, revealing a monarch who had sacrificed her mental clarity on the altar of an ideal she could no longer sustain. Perhaps the most tragic passages came in the letter's closing lines. Elizabeth described herself as a ghost haunting the throne of my own making, a spectral presence that lingered in chambers once dominated by her youthful vigour. She admitted deep regret for the sacrifices she had made in pursuit of an impossible standard of eternal youth and beauty, sacrifices that had ultimately destroyed her from within. The Queen who had given her name to an age now laid bare the bitter irony of her reign, that the very image she had fought so hard to maintain was a phantom created by poison. Her final words echoed with sorrow and a plea for understanding. She expressed a wish to warn future generations of rulers, urging them to recognize that power cannot rest upon mere appearance. Elizabeth implored them to value substance over semblance, to guard the soul as vigilantly as the crown. In her parting sentences, she acknowledged the cruelty of her own vanity, lamenting that her greatest triumphs had been overshadowed by her ultimate self-betrayal. The immediate suppression of this letter by James I and his advisers speaks volumes about its potentially explosive content. To reveal that England's greatest queen had spent her last years slowly poisoning herself, and possibly at the behest of those she trusted, would have shattered the carefully constructed myth of Gloriana, the virgin queen whose reign was an unbroken triumph of intellect and poise. James and his council moved swiftly to secure the document. The crimson ribbon binding it was cut, the box sealed, and the letter consigned to the deepest vault of the royal archives. In the years that followed, the testament disappeared from memory, its existence whispered only in rumours. Court chroniclers hinted at a hidden memoir, a final confession that had been buried alongside the Queen's cosmetic implements and cracked porcelain jars. Noble families passing down tales in hushed conversation spoke of a letter too terrible to read, a narrative so laden with horror it had been locked away to preserve the legacy of Elizabeth's golden age. Yet the rumours persisted, carried by those who believed that history should not be sanitized. Gentlemen and ladies spoke in private of a queen who had been both architect and victim of her own downfall. They speculated on the fate of the document, whether it lay forgotten on a dusty shelf, its ink fading with the years, or whether it had been destroyed to protect the reputation of the crown. Some claimed to have glimpsed a reference in a forgotten diary, others whispered of a copy hidden in a noble's estate, awaiting rediscovery. Even today, the legend of Elizabeth's final letter endures as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of perfection, no matter how regal, may lead to ruin. The notion of a sovereign so consumed by her own image that she wrote candidly of self-poisoning and conspiracies in her court strikes a dissonant chord against the polished portraits that hang in gilded frames. These portraits, bearing her flawless, ageless visage, mask the truth of a woman who bore the heaviest crown of all the crown of her own vanity. And so, the letter remains a phantom in its own right, an artifact of raw confession, hidden from view yet alive in the imagination of those who seek the unvarnished truth behind history's grand narratives. It stands as a testament to the perils of equating beauty with power, and to the vulnerability of even the mightiest among us when faced with the shadow of decay. In the hush of the archives, where candlelight no longer glimmers and dust settles on silken pillows, Elizabeth's final words lie dormant, waiting to awaken generations to the tragic consequence of a queen painting her own epitaph in lead and sorrow. On the 24th of March, in the year 1603, in the early hours of a cold spring morning, Queen Elizabeth I drew her final breath in a chamber that had become a monument to the vanity that slowly killed her. The room where she died was a haunting tableau of artificial beauty and natural decay, walls lined with tarnished mirrors that reflected only shadows, tables strewn with cosmetic pots whose contents could no longer conceal the horror of her condition, and velvet drapes stained by the acrid odour of chemicals that clung to the air. The woman who had once commanded the seas and vanquished Europe's greatest empire lay alone, save for a handful of attendants too terrified to approach her bedside, surrounded by the very instruments of her self-destruction. In the final weeks of her life, the daily ritual of makeup, once a 4-hour ceremony, consumed her every waking moment. Her hands, now too frail and trembling to apply the elaborate layers herself, forced her to rely upon her ladies-in-waiting. Each morning they would gather in anxious silence, mixing ceruse into a thick, leaden paste meant to restore the illusion of youth. With gloved fingers, they pressed the cold, white substance onto Elizabeth's ulcerated skin, building layer upon layer until her face resembled a death mask more than a human visage. Any sense of personal agency in the process had vanished, replaced by a silent compulsion to be made whole again, even if that wholeness was a lie. The Queen's complexion, once the talk of every court in Europe, had become a grotesque parody of its former glory. Deep sores and weeping lesions peered out from beneath the heavy paste, their dark centres peeking through cracks that formed with every shift of her skin. Attendants whispered that some mornings they found flakes of ceruse clinging to her sheets, brittle as fossilized snow, yet they were unable to refuse her. Elizabeth, brittle as winter branches, would not endure an imperfect application. They trembled as they worked, aware that a single misstep, a smudge of rouge out of place, an uneven stroke of powder might provoke her fury, or send her into tears of shame and self-loathing. Worse than the physical agony was the knowledge that those powders, pressed and patted onto her wounds, were slowly poisoning her. In her moments of lucidity, Elizabeth understood the cruel irony. The substances meant to conceal her suffering only deepened it, inch by inch. She caught glimpses of her reflection in the blackened glass of a candle holder, and recoiled at the sight of a cracked mask clinging to a face ravaged by chemical burn. Yet, even then, she refused to let the truth show. Her identity, long forged in the crucible of politics and diplomacy, depended upon that mask, upon the illusion of unchanging beauty that she believed her subjects and her foreign allies demanded. Her final convulsions were terrifying in their suddenness and intensity. Lead toxicity, which had for years eroded her strength, finally erupted into acute episodes of seizure. On one fateful dawn, the Queen's body shook so violently that the layers of makeup fractured and sloughed away in chunks, revealing raw, mottled flesh that glistened with discharge. The attendants gasped and recoiled as if struck, but dared not touch her until the shaking subsided. When it did, Elizabeth lay gasping, her breath ragged and uneven, eyes fluttering as though torn between waking and dreaming. She opened her mouth, and a cracked, tremulous voice whispered to unseen figures in the room, "Mother, sister, forgive me." These moments of delirium grew more frequent as the days waned. Elizabeth would suddenly bolt upright in her bed, arms outstretched, addressing phantom visitors who drifted at the edge of her vision. She spoke to the ghosts that had haunted her mind for months, Anne Boleyn's accusing gaze, Mary Tudor's cold reproach, and other figures whose names she muttered in half-formed phrases. Attendants watched in stricken horror, tears glistening in their eyes as they realized their queen was lost to a world of her own tormented making. Between convulsions, her breathing would slow to a fragile rasp, each inhalation a visible struggle. Cushions were fluffed behind her back to support her ravaged frame, yet she quivered as though chilled to the bone. A thin film of sweat coated her brow, mixing with the powder that framed her temples and cheeks. Every breath exhaled a faint metallic tang, the taste of death upon her tongue. Despite the pallor of her skin, her pulse raced unevenly, thumping in her wrists like the distant thunder of approaching storms. In these final hours, word spread swiftly through the palace. Staircases emptied, candles were extinguished, and corridors fell silent save for the soft sobs of chaplains murmuring last rites outside her door. Those few who remained near her drew close, offering prayers and whispered comforts, though none could truly soothe her. Even in her final waking moments, Elizabeth's lips parted as though to speak again to the spectres that filled her chamber, but only a faint sigh emerged, as if she were too weary to form words. At last, sometime before dawn, her body grew still. The tremors ceased, and the gasps quieted into stillness. A hush fell upon the room, broken only by the crackle of a single candle guttering in its brass stand. The Queen's face, once artfully concealed beneath countless layers of leaded powder, now lay exposed to the dim light, hollowed cheeks marked by scar tissue, eyelids drawn with fatigue, and a mouth pressed into a final, sorrowful line. Her famous red wig had slipped from its pins, revealing pale stubble upon her scalp. Even the most devoted attendants averted their eyes from the rawness of her features, for in those features lay the truth of years spent trading health for illusion. In death, Elizabeth's chamber became an unintended memorial to her tragic vanity. The shattered pieces of her cosmetic jars lay scattered like offerings at the foot of her bed. Mirrors, once prized for their ability to perfect her image, stood cracked and clouded, reflecting only shards of light that danced across the bloodless contours of her face. The velvet curtains, once drawn carefully to filter daylight, hung limp as though mourning the loss of their mistress. The passing of Elizabeth Tudor marked not only the end of a reign, but also the conclusion of a singularly poignant tragedy. The woman who had survived every external threat, Spanish armadas, assassination plots, religious wars, had ultimately succumbed to an enemy forged by her own hand. In death, as in life, she remained inseparable from the image she had laboured so fiercely to preserve, a visage of greatness and decay intertwined. And though the world beyond Richmond Palace would soon awaken to news of her demise, within those silent walls lay the final testament to a queen whose most enduring legacy would be the haunting reminder of the perilous price of painting one's own epitaph in powder and poison. And that is the tragic story of the final years of Queen Elizabeth I, a narrative we have explored together. Today, we have not only recounted a historic event, but also delved into the hidden psychological depths of one of history's greatest figures. This video has taken us on a journey back through time and has offered profound messages and values that resonate with our own lives today. The first message we can glean from Elizabeth I's story concerns the price of vanity and the importance of self-acceptance. Elizabeth spent her entire life crafting a flawless image, refusing to acknowledge the natural processes of aging and the imperfections they left behind. She chose a toxic mask rather than accept her scars, a potent reminder that in our modern society where pressure over appearance remains immense, pursuing an unattainable standard of beauty can lead to horrific consequences. Her story teaches us that true beauty does not lie in layers of paint and powder, but instead in the confidence and courage to face our own flaws. Second, this tale offers a lesson in power and loneliness. Elizabeth I was a powerful monarch, yet in the end she died alone. She rejected marriage to preserve her authority, but that very decision deprived her of companionship and empathy in her final years. She became trapped in a gilded cage of power, unable to trust anyone or reveal her vulnerabilities and fears. This is a thoughtful message for modern life, where many reach the pinnacle of career and status, only to find themselves beset by solitude and emotional strain. Power cannot purchase happiness, and material success cannot substitute for genuine relationships. Finally, Elizabeth's story serves as a warning about the danger of hiding the truth. The Queen attempted to conceal her deteriorating health, not only from her subjects, but from herself. This denial drove her further into a cycle of self-destruction. In contemporary life, we too often hide our own struggles, whether physical ailments or emotional wounds, for fear of judgment or appearing weak. Elizabeth's experience shows us that confronting and accepting the truth, however painful, is the only path to healing and peace. As we conclude this video, I hope that the story of Elizabeth I has given you a fresh perspective on history and, more importantly, valuable lessons you can apply in your own life. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey so tragic yet deeply human. If you are still awake, I wish you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. I'll see you in the next videos. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our new and greatest stories.